Hello, welcome everyone to the latest Pods of War podcast with me, John Buckley, Spencer Jones and Howard Fuller. Another discussion of great importance and transfer of knowledge, wit and wisdom. And this session we're going to be discussing something which may be of interest to those who are thinking of studying more deeply, looking at their subject in a kind of different way. Because we want to discuss books which have meant something of great importance to us in terms of how we've guided our learning and our interest in our subjects, why we think they're important, not necessarily the greatest works of historical literature or writing or whatever, but something which has meant something to us and why we think they're important. So that's what we're going to try and do. That's the plan, I believe, isn't it, gentlemen?
Certainly is.
Sounds good, John.
Okay, so that's okay. So it seems reticent at the moment to before we get into it, but let's start with we've each chosen at this stage 3 books. Howard tells us he's got a whole series of other volumes and things on standby just in case to bombard us with. Well, let's see how we go with the ones we've gone with, and we're going to start with Howard, I think. So. Kick off for us. Tell us of a book of great worth, and tell us why it's important. And then let's see where we go with that.
Okay, thanks, John. All right, so my first choice for a book would be a very small book. I'll sort of hold it up to the camera here. It's very tiny, innocent, unassuming volume. It's not very weighty.
Is that your sales pitch? Is that your sales pitch? It's small and it's thin, so that's what's going to appeal to
something. Yes, you can read this between tube stops. Whatever. Put your phone down for 5 minutes and quickly read this book. The book, however, like another one of my choices, as I'll get into, is deceptive. It is the tip of an iceberg. It's the thin edge of a wedge. It's Will and Ariel Durant's The Lessons of History. And what this was a tiny little volume that came out at the end of their huge, sprawling 9-volume Story of Civilization series, which I mentioned in our last podcast as being one of my influential books. These 2 authors, husband and wife team, were churning out Pulitzer Prize-winning history in the 1950s and 60s. And having stopped at the 19th century, they gave it a while, and they decided that maybe they should just come up with a sort of conclusion, as it were. And how do you conclude something that vast and that sprawling? Because those types of histories, I don't think, really happen anymore. I'm not really aware of too many other historians out there who do. Well, I'd say each volume was probably about 150,000 words. So they wrote over 1 million published words in a long, sprawling history of, say, Western civilization at least, although it included some Chinese history, Middle Eastern history, and all the rest. And, okay, what would they possibly have to say? Well, the lessons of history, for me, were very good for exactly that reason, that can you possibly say anything comprehensible about history, having looked at all of history, international history, for a long period of time, writing 1 million published words about it and so forth? What could you possibly say at the end of it that's maybe it's probably about 10 or 15,000 words or less? And it was good. It was very good. I'm not going to tell you what they said. What I will do really quick is just say that they broke down their topic into things like character and history, government and history, growth and decay, is progress real, and all the rest. But they also had a chapter on, for example, I remember war. And the thing about this volume that I like, and the thing about this volume that a lot of people perhaps were frustrated with at the time and will be frustrated with forever and ever afterwards, is what it doesn't tell you. It doesn't give you, in fact, actual conclusions. It doesn't tell you what a lesson of history is, or what the truth of history is. It's one of these exercises in history, as we like to tell our students at the University of Wolverhampton, as we were all educated as well. I'm sure that history is very much like peeling an onion. You could peel back more and more layers. There's something to peeling an onion in that process, but at the end of it, you're kind of left with nothing. There isn't really hardcore, indisputable truths. Even facts are sort of, well, there's facts, but then there's interpretations of evidence and all the rest of it. There could be raging schools, in fact, of interpretations over, different bodies of evidence and all the rest of it. People trying to out research one another, piling on the facts. But what are the actual lessons? And as with a lot of the best histories out there, I think the lessons that the Durants offered in this particular volume are profound. They stay with you. You know that there's a lot of wisdom seeping through every page, and yet you can't quite put your finger on how this is actually going to help anyone get through, say, a crisis. What are we going to do about the Ukraine, or what are we going to do about this particular thing? How is the past actually going to help us with decision making in the present, or perhaps even more, elusive and tempting? What is the past going to tell us about the future? Because, of course, writing in the 1960s, as the Durants did, a lot of people were becoming very concerned about the future, given the Cold War context and the minor blips like the Cuban Missile Crisis and all the rest of it. People were getting quite scared at what the trajectory of history, particularly military history, was. So it was very interesting to see what historians like the Durants would come out and tell us what the past can tell us in terms of lessons, in terms of where we are today and what the prospect is and what we could do perhaps about the future. And John and Spence, like I said, this is one of those books that always stuck with me as a sort of golden prize at the end of a lot of reading and research and insight and analysis that tells you things but doesn't tell you things. It makes you a bit wiser for reading it. I have no doubt about that. But at the same time, it's elusive and actually telling you what to do. And that to me, I think, is one of those golden gems of not just military history, but good history, period. So that's one of my
Well,
choices.
it's yeah, no, it sounds quite interesting, and particularly the angle about how there are no specific answers, and I always find that that's one of the biggest issues that people coming to study at undergraduate level, also postgraduate level, is that there are no finite answers to things. There are just differing levels of interpretations, and some are more convincing than others, and how the periods of time make you think about those interpretations differently. And that's always a bit of a step change, say from in the UK when you do A levels, where there's still, I think, I get the impression, O level in my day as well as GCSE, that there's a set. This is interpreted. This is what you've got to learn. And when you get to universities, well, there isn't an answer. There are just different answers. So that sounds quite interesting, really, as a book.
It's not the kind of thing that would appear on a university reading list because, again, a lot of students
Okay.
might be digging through it saying, I'm sorry, where are the answers here? I'm going through this looking for the answer. And it's like, well, the answer is there. It's just, I don't know how to put it. I'm not trying to be, Zen like Buddhist about it or something like that. I'm not saying it's there is a spoon, there is no spoon, bend the goddamn spoon with your mind, but there is something about the process of how history works that's extremely beneficial and important for, the human psyche and civilization and all the rest of it. It's a sort of between the lines thing.
In that
If you take it for
sense,
granted, and if you're looking for just facts, you're
in
going to
that
miss out.
sense, I
Do it now, Spence. Do it now.
was going to say I've got a gap now. Do you think it's more appropriate for undergraduate or postgraduates, or both?
Well, I would say both. In fact, the Durants weren't even necessarily writing for students. I was being taught, I know, out of the Durants for part of the time when I was in American high school. So when I was a junior, third year, and senior, fourth year American high school student, I was, 15, 16, 17. I was being fed some of the Durants as well. I knew it was the Durants. Some of my classmates didn't know it was the Durants. I was nerd enough to know what we were being taught. But there's nothing wrong with teaching out of the Durants today at universities. I just don't think they're still being taught. But the Durants were writing for everyone, which was another reason that I really respect their work. It was an everyman's work, and I think that's part of the reason why their work won the Pulitzer.
This is going on. Well, okay, fair enough. I mean, this is a whole range of stuff that was also used in the other side of the Atlantic. It's not something I've particularly heard of. It sounds quite interesting. It's something that you could work with. Okay, all right, fair enough. Okay, interesting stuff. Interesting left field kind of start there, rather than a staple ag. Go on then, Spencer. Hit us with something that appeals to you.
Well, mine's a little bit of a left field choice as well because it's nothing to do with my research specialities. But I picked Black Hearts by Jim Frederick. Now, Jim Frederick's not a historian. He was the editor of Time. He's a journalist, effectively. And Black Hearts is actually about a very serious war crime in Iraq committed by members of the 101st Airborne, a rape murder of Iraqi civilians. And although he's not a historian, I think it's a really interesting example of the intersection between history and journalism. It's been said that journalists are the first historians. And he approaches this pretty ghastly story with a real journalist's eye. And of course, the advantage of being a journalist rather than a historian is you can interview people who are involved, you can get the story hot off the press, essentially. And his research for this was meticulous. He interviewed just about everybody he could lay his hands on, visited Iraq, studied this in astonishing depth. And of course, it's a ghastly story. What I think he does extremely well is he tells a ghastly story in a very looking for the correct word here, but a careful way. This isn't a sensational piece. It's not the equivalent of a true crime podcast, something that's designed to make you go, oh, isn't that ghastly? It's actually a really good study of why do even highly trained soldiers start to descend into this atavistic violence. And he presents an extremely clever, he takes them from training in the US before they go to Iraq and their slow degradation of the unit in Iraq due to casualties, leadership errors. He's got a brilliant account of just the pressure of what it was like to be patrolling in a Humvee in the era when IEDs were everywhere. You just didn't know if at one moment your Humvee was going to be 30 feet in the air and you were going to be in pieces. And the way that the unit breaks down, and of course he condemns what happens, but what I think is brilliant about the book is you understand why it's happened. This isn't a case of he doesn't have a particular axe to grind on this. This isn't just a case of, look at these clearly deranged people, these clearly evil people doing evil things. It's instead, how do we go from highly trained, highly respected to committing war crimes? What has happened in that process? And the answers aren't particularly comfortable, but I also think they're quite universal. So he identifies death of popular leaders. A crucial lieutenant in the platoon gets killed quite early on in a way that really upsets his troops. The colonel of the unit is shall we say, he is not a people person. The second in command is overworked. There's all kinds of problems, and it's like watching a slow motion disaster that's going to end in horror and tragedy. And I think it's an absolutely brilliant book. It's a difficult book because it deals with terrible things, but it's also an extremely interesting book because it deals with very human things. And as much as we can sometimes just think about every soldier's highly trained and they wouldn't do this, or these kind of things don't happen, or it's just a few bad apples. What I think this book does is it exposes you to uncomfortable truths about both war, the nature of it, and humans, and the nature of humans. Why do humans do terrible things, and why is this the case? And although, of course, it's about an incident in Iraq, you can apply it on a wider frame if you want to look at war crimes or violence towards civilians in general terms in almost any conflict of the 20th century or the 21st century. I think there's a lot to be said there. It's a book that stuck with me as well. I read it essentially on a whim. I think I found it in a charity shop and just picked it up, and I read it. I found it very hard to put down, even though it's an extremely unpleasant subject matter, and it's stuck with me ever since. And it's a book I think is really worth reading. I think people skip over it because its subject matter is grim, because it's written by a journalist. But I think as a great example of a journalist's history and something that we can apply to in a much wider sense, I think it's a terrific book and one that deserves to be read by anybody studying this aspect of war, not just the Iraq War, but war as an act of violence in general.
So who would you recommend to read it in terms of if you were thinking of teaching or a course or what
So
context?
at Wolverhampton, I've set it as undergraduate reading. Now, it hasn't always. It has to be explained because obviously the students will look at it and. So I teach a course about command and leadership, for example, an undergraduate course, which discusses particular pressures of being in counterinsurgency war and what are these problems, how do they differ from conventional war. And I try and give the students some extracts from Black Hearts and get them to engage with it that way because they inevitably tend to sort of shy away from it. It's, as Howard, you were saying about the earlier volume, it doesn't give you direct answers. It's not going to help you answer an essay question directly, but it will help shape your knowledge. And it's challenging. It's a challenging read. You know, students have said they've found it difficult, not because of the language, but just because the subject matter is challenging, and it's not something that you would read for pleasure. But I think it's a really good looking under the turning the stone over and saying, well, what really happens? What does this really mean? And it's very, very powerful in that sense. So I think I wouldn't necessarily give it to a first year undergraduate who's still finding their feet, but I give it to second year undergraduates, and once they can be persuaded to engage with it, they start to gain a lot more from it. And then the next question is, well, if this can happen to very highly trained American paratroopers, what happens when you've got troops who aren't so well trained or troops who are under similar positions and so on? And you can start getting a quite powerful discussion going from that.
Yeah, that sounds
That
good. I mean,
makes me
I
think
do
of
some teaching around.
well, John, are you? I was just
Oh,
going to say that makes me think of
no. I thought you were going to say something sage-like and wise there, Howard, and then you stopped.
no,
I mean,
not here.
I don't
No,
know if
I
that's
just
indicative of something.
well, I was going to say it reminds me of things like All Quiet on the Western Front in more ways than one, because there you have non-professional conscripts, let's say, who go through a process of degradation, that war grinds them down. And through the process, the eyes of the narrator, he watches men in his platoon or his unit get killed, go insane, uh, start committing atrocities against civilians and all the rest is sort of degradation, but also written by someone who wasn't classed as a academic or a professional military historian. There's that on the one hand, but then also something like Crane's Red Badge of Courage for the Civil War, same thing, written by a so-called non-professional, slightly a novelist, even as opposed to a journalist, and yet same thing, watching how the experience of war itself tends to chip away at our conceptions of what professional soldiery is about and what the experience of combat is and the impact of leadership and intangible factors as well.
Mm. Yeah, along the same kind of lines, I was going to say that when I did some work on the Northwest European campaign, and we use sources, memoirs, and things of those who've who fought and the experiences they go through, and these are mostly conscript soldiers with a few professionals and so on, and how they adapt to those circumstances. And then it's a difficult line because sometimes you get writers going back to look at this kind of stuff, and they're almost critical of soldiers, saying, "Look, they've done this," or "It's a great revelation that soldiers don't do what they're supposed to do and stick to rules and norms or what is expected of them." But of course, the violence and the circumstances around them leads them to do things that they wouldn't otherwise have done. And it's no kind of great revelation, but it is when you put it in a kind of a particular way. So, it can be challenging that people think, well, people do this and they're supposed to be, particularly when they're looking at the troops from the US or the UK or France or whatever, and they're supposed to be on our side, and yet they still do this kind of thing, our side, inverted commas.
I think that's a real strength of Black Hearts that it takes this unit, and it's certainly, obviously it's condemns. It's not an apology in any way, but you understand why it's happened, and it gets across the unique horrors, really, and that's the only way you can describe it, of being in that it's Iraq when the insurgency is at its height. It gets across that sense of cultural alienation, the sense of frustration. You're having men killed, but you can't fight back. The way that small things get lost, popular officers get killed, discipline changes slightly, attitudes change slightly, and it's a really insightful book on how a small unit is slowly ground down, despite of course people trying to stop it. And I think that's anybody who's interested, for example, in the see, there's war crimes in the news again with the current Russia-Ukraine war, and if you're interested about why do soldiers commit war crimes, obviously there's a great literature on this, but I think something like Black Arts can give you a real insight into all the small pressures that go on a military unit and how that leads to explosions of violence. I know there's obviously an academic body of work on this, but I think, as you say, John, it's very easy sometimes for historians to go back and say, "Oh, crikey, look, these soldiers doing unpleasant things in wartime. Isn't this a revelation?" This is where I think a book like Black Arts, which is more immediate, written with all the participants still alive, has got a special kind of power, and it's written, I think, in a very balanced way, and it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary, I think.
Oh, interesting and deep stuff. Well, I'm going to lower the tone now with my first choice, which is not so deep at all, but quite personal, and it's a book which I picked off a shelf when I was 9 years old, and completely on a whim. I just thought, what's this? I like the look of the cover, and thought, and so I'm going to read this. And it was the first, what I would describe as proper military history book, in a popular narrative kind of sense. And it was Peter C. Smith's book, The Battle of Midway, which it's quite an old-fashioned, straightforward narrative military history of the Battle of Midway, and what, for someone who's 9, I remember reading 9. It must have been because the film with Chuck Heston came out in 1976, and I remember being inspired to go and see the Battle of Midway, the film, because I'd read that book. So I must have only been 8, 9, something like that when I got it and read it.
You are such a nerd.
And it was just, I know, absolutely. I'd never heard really of the Pacific War or the Asia Pacific War, as we now call it. So it's completely new. But the whole thing about the language, the way he expressed the story, it was written very much in kind of an engaging style. The kind of way a lot of narrative military historians continue to engage with kind of the Max Hastings and James Hollands and people like this who write stuff which is supposed to engage people in the subject whilst trying to transfer some knowledge or understanding of the topic. And I just remember the kind of the revelation that history or military history was written in this kind of way, as opposed to Warlord Monthly or Commando books or something like this. And even on from things like Hamlin's Big Book of the Second World War or Collins' History of the Second World War. This was a much deeper narrative. It was like 200-300 pages, something like that. But the way he traced the story of Midway and the idea of using carriers and aviation and so on, and what leads to Pearl Harbor and then to the whole Midway story. And it's really a very accessible and engaging style. I remember as well that we had to do, my primary school, we had to do elocution as part of our studies, and one of the things we had to do a presentation, and I did a reading from the Battle of Midway about the how the United States Army Air Force B-17s claimed to have sunk half the Japanese fleet, and they
I can imagine all the girls huddling around you after that presentation, John.
Absolutely, it just captured everybody.
All the students put
I remember as well
on their shoulders.
Absolutely, totally, and they thought, this is it. This is a future. Well, it was mine anyway. But now, I mean, Peter C. Smith is kind of and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, a kind of pop military historian. Wrote loads of books about a whole range of military history. But it was written in a way that's kind of engaging to somebody to get you interested in a particular subject. I don't recommend it now necessarily for when we teach this undergraduate or even postgraduate level, but because it's been surpassed, or there are lots of other books and things, and continue to study the Battle of Midway. Smith got quite a number of things wrong. He's moved things. Even he has moved things on. He wrote another book about 4 or 5 years ago about the same subject, in which he dealt with all the revelations and the questions about why there was a cover up in the US Navy about how one of their air commanders had made a complete balls up of the assault on the 4th of June, and gone in the wrong direction, and his commander, when he returned, covered it up. And there's a big story about how that happened. Then there was a story about the good angles here on oral history. Many of the American pilots claimed that as they were diving down on the Japanese carriers were all the aircraft were fueled up, ready to go. One of the aircraft was trying to take off at the start of their launch operations. The Americans, just in the nick of time, found the Japanese carriers and sank 3 of them, and it changed entire course. So there's a whole debate now about actually the Japanese weren't ready to launch at all, and there weren't any aircraft. It didn't happen in that kind of way. So you get some kind of angles about that, why historians write those particular kind of things, because it's engaging, it's exciting, and then yet when it comes to it, the reality is somewhat different. So I would still, however, say if anybody is interested in the Battle of Midway, you can't go that far wrong in reading it. You wouldn't read it alone now if you wanted to know about it, but it was a classic kind of engaging pop military history on a subject that's absolutely fascinating. Everybody knows he's interested in the Battle of Midway. Even a First World War historian knows something about the Battle of Midway, don't they, Spence?
Quite right too. So that's quite interesting. It actually leads me to another question about. So you picked this up at the age of 9.
Yeah.
So do you still own your copy?
I do. I wanted to wave it at you this morning, but it's on my collection of books at work rather than at home. But I do have it, and we'll place it in there. It's the same copy, the cover, as the one that I got, and it was a fold-out one. So you open the first page, and then there was another colour plate on the inside, another facing colour plate, and so it's like a big panoramic view of a steely-faced American pilot looking down as they've flown over the Japanese fleet. So a Japanese carrier bursting into flames, a huge plume of smoke and everything. The interior plate has now fallen out. I don't have that, but I do still have the cover. It's very well thumbed. It's brown. It's falling apart. It's been reprinted a number of times. It's still considered despite some mistakes that Smith admit he made in the book. It's still considered a bit of an easy reading classic on the subject. So I thoroughly
John,
recommend.
Thank you for sharing with us your first time. you're sort of very delicate, very gentle experience.
It is, but, yeah. But unlike many other first times, this was really good. So, I mean,
I think what strikes me about what you're saying with that book is as a 9-year-old, in many ways, if I may, it's your first introduction to nonfiction, right? So I've got an 8-year-old. He's 8.5. And I have to say that when you were talking, I was thinking to myself, most of the stuff that my sons are being raised on, just as a matter of course, I don't know why, is fiction. So it's bedtime stories, it's fairy tales, it's whatever, Disney films or something like that. It's always fiction. At what point does a son or a daughter get introduced to nonfiction and they like it? Because as you say, with good history, good military history, the nonfiction is also a drama. So it's your first introduction to a drama that's not a fairy tale. It's not concocted. It's actually real. And the fact that it is real and that you're conscious, perhaps when you're 8, 9, 10, however old, that impresses you more than anything, that this actually happened, that this was real. It wasn't a legend. It wasn't a myth. It's history. For as much as we complain about how history gets mythologized and gets turned into legend and all the rest of it, the first time, as you say, that we're introduced to something that's nonfiction, it's history, it impresses upon us because it's real and it's also interesting. It's a drama. You get involved in the story. You get involved in the characters as such, and you're intellectually tickled perhaps for the first time in terms of why things happened or how they could have gone differently or why things were important or how things that happened then have impacted the way life is ever since. So yeah, actually it's quite interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I've my two children. One reads fiction all the time. She won't read. factual books at all, completely uninterested, whereas my son does. He reads lots of, I have to say, all about science and maths and things like that. He's fascinated by maths and things, but not so much history. But at that age, I was reading more factual books and things rather than fiction, I suppose. But it's a fair point that I think there's a greater emphasis now on getting children to read fiction, and you've got to, every kid who gets to about 10 or 11, if they've not read Harry Potter, there's some kind of, they're ostracised from society and so on. But hey, anyway, right, let's move on. Howard, go on, give us your second great work.
All right. Well, my second great work was on my university reading list as an undergraduate. I make sure that it's on the reading list for more than one course that we offer at Wolverhampton, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, BA Honors War Studies, or say the MA Military History. Perhaps not surprisingly, it's James Mcpherson's Battle Cry of Freedom. So this also was a Pulitzer Prize winner. It came out in 1988, so I was a sophomore at Ohio State, and almost as soon as it came out, it was hot off the presses. Wick Murray and the others made sure that it was on our reading list. We had to go out and buy this. James Mcpherson made lots of initial royalties off of our student tuition, and we bought it. And I have to say, it was a big, fat, imposing volume. It still is. And it was a bit daunting as an undergraduate student. You're like going, oh, my God. But it was only after you started reading it that you realized the miracle of what Mcpherson actually accomplished with Battle Cry of Freedom, which is that he took, well, it was two miracles. A, he took a topic that is still to this day the most single published area of American military history ever written about, the American Civil War. We're still fascinated and predominated by the American Civil War, what it meant for the growth of the United States, the ordeal of the Republic, the challenge, all the rest of it. And he was able to tell something new, something interesting. So that is also a lesson that we try to give to our students. Take inspiration from the fact that there's never a last word on history, and no, not everything has already been researched and written. There's still plenty to explore. There's still new ways of telling the same old thing, you could say, in ways that have never been told before and are still very interesting and very impactful and all the rest of it. But secondly, he also told a single comprehensive volume of the entire American Civil War in one volume, which is still very much no small feat, because one of my runner-ups choice for this was Bruce Catton. So I cut my teeth. A lot of my American Civil War historiography, as many American Civil War historians do, on Bruce Catton's centennial historical works. The Army of the Potomac series, Grant Takes Command. I love Bruce Catton. And again, not necessarily an academic or a formal military historian as such, almost writing it from a journalistic point, but the research impeccable, very good, beautiful storytelling. Again, Pulitzer Prize winning for Catton. But here's Mcpherson, who in a way was sort of encapsulating a lot of Bruce Catton's scope and putting it into one volume. And it was beautifully researched. It was a lovely combination of integrating primary archival-based primary research with published memoirs, letter collections, and also engaging with cutting-edge published scholarship. So academic monographs, peer-reviewed journal articles. It was just it was a tour de force, and it remains so to this day. And it's a good example to students. So we say, well, look, you want to know if you can still how to write history. Part of the reason we assign you these works is because they're good role models to follow. And Mcpherson was still doing that. The other thing I like about Battle Cry of Freedom is the way that he handled it in terms of subsequent revised editions, because he did come out somewhat notoriously in his second revised edition as taking a slightly more political stance, which is to say that he attacked neo-Confederates and libertarians and all the rest of it. He has this sort of concluding essay talking about how the lost cause myth and American Civil War historiography was successfully hijacked by the South after the Civil War during Reconstruction, revitalized in the 1920s and all the rest of it, and sort of almost ran the risk of becoming a white supremacist narrative, the American Civil War and American history as it was taught. And Mcpherson decided quite consciously with his work, with his analysis, with his expertise, to come out against this and say, well, actually, the whole lost cause thing is ridiculous. The way that it's been politicized ever since is practically dangerous. And he calls them out. And it made him very unpopular to a lot of people in American society. You won't find Battle Cry of Freedom on white supremacist UK Civil War history websites of their own, I imagine. And I've had a couple of students over the years, even teaching with University of Maryland, who were very pro-South. And they try to attack Mcpherson as being biased and all the rest of it. And you have to say, well, how is he biased? Where exactly do you think his command of the facts and his storytelling is inaccurate? You have to be specific. They can't. They can't touch him. He's a top-notch historian. The only thing I'll add about this book is that it really propelled his career to the point where he became president of the American Historical Association. And I remembered that when I was giving a paper at an annual conference of the AHA, which was in Washington, D.C., this was in 2002, 2003, James Mcpherson was giving the inaugural lecture. So I did meet him, and I was enthralled, and I was very fascinated by seeing him. However, he took the occasion of his address at the AHA to make some very pointed remarks about the war in Iraq, I think it was. And I have to say, I was sitting in the audience I was finishing my PhD at that time, and I have to say, I sat in the audience and I went, "Oh no, what's he doing?" Because to me, I thought he was grandstanding a little bit and stepping across the line. So it's one thing to talk about American historiography, American Civil War historiography, and put his own, I suppose, opinion, if not a political slant, into it. But it's another thing to use that as a platform to talk about what should or should not be done in American foreign policy today. That, to me, struck me as kind of a taboo, the kind of things that historians, military historians, probably shouldn't do. Stick with the history and let the history speak for itself. Okay, but still, it's a classic work. It's hard to find competitors to that kind of treatment of a well-trod topic that's come out ever since.
I remember using that when we started American Civil War module at university. I set it with a previous colleague, Mark Fitton. It's like 20 odd years ago, and that was kind of one of the required readings on that. And I used that in terms of mugging up sufficiently to be able to get through the American Civil War without making a buffoon of myself. But yeah, and I remember it's a really impressive piece of literature, isn't it?
Very reliable.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Just because I'm not up to date with the latest Civil War literature, is there anything that rivals it nowadays?
Well, I mean, you had people like Shelby Foote, for example, famously coming out with multi-volume series, but I tend to find that a lot of people who write one-volume histories of the Civil War now jettison a lot of research and footnoting and all the rest of it, because again, perhaps they're under pressure from their publishers not to make it quite so meaty as Mcpherson got away with perhaps in the 1980s. It's a right kind of balance to offer something that's scholarly and yet popular enough that you could publish something that thick, well researched, and still feel like a publisher can get a lot of mileage out of it. So I don't know, a cynic in me, or cynics in military history who deal with publishers anymore, might say that the publishing industry might have gotten away with Mcpherson back in the late 80s, but that kind of thing won't happen today. I don't know, unless you can get away with a multi-volume series history of the Civil War as well. So it's kind of stretch the story out, try to fix it over several volumes to get your full research, full justice. Maybe. But no, I think in many ways I haven't seen anything that's quite topped him. There might be people out there who go, oh well, he's forgetting this, but no, I don't know. I still find Mcpherson quite reliable.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Interesting. Yes, it's nice to know that there is so far. There's one person's other book that I've actually read, which I know what you're talking about, as opposed to other things. I think, oh, interesting, but I've not read it yet. So Spence, go on. What's your second?
So I was actually I'm gonna change tack a little bit because of the that Howard's just picked, but mine's a US Civil War book. So it's actually part of a multi-volume series, and I'm picking one simply because it's the first one I read. I read it completely out of sequence, or I picked this book out of sequence. I've subsequently read the entire series, and it's Gordon C. Rear's Cold Harbor, Grant and Lee, May 26th to June the 3rd, 1864. Now, Gordon C. Rear is not a full-time historian. He's actually a lawyer in the US, and he's written, I think he's up to 6 volumes now, a blow-by-blow study, multi-volume study of the Overland Campaign in Virginia in early 1864 into the sort of mid-1864. So I read Cold Harbor actually when I was researching my MPhil on the American Civil War, and it was billed as a revisionist study of this battle. It's often billed as a sort of first day of the Somme, except in the USA. Thousands of people mown down. If you've seen the Ken Burns documentary, in the opening narration where it's talking about the legacy of the Civil War, he cites Cold Harbor as an incident where thousands of American soldiers were killed in a matter of minutes. And Gordon Rear's book breaks down this battle and shows, well, what actually happened, shows that the figures that are bandied about are completely false. Yes, it's an extremely bloody battle, and there's an awful lot goes wrong, especially for the Union. But carefully and precisely, perhaps because of his background as a lawyer, he carefully and precisely demolishes this myth. And it was so beautifully written, and I still believe it's beautifully written. I think the whole series is beautifully written. They are narrative histories because they have a beginning, middle, and end, and they cover a period of the campaign in each volume. But they're written with such a richness to them because these aren't just telling you the story. He tells you new things about the battle, and he's very concerned about removing myths and challenging ideas, whether they are legends that have grown up around the battle or whether they are things that have appeared in subsequent histories. He's very precise. His research is very precise. And he takes these myths apart and shows you what really happened. And what he gets across fantastically is he makes very complicated battles understandable without letting you forget that these are very chaotic, confusing battles. And I think the way that he did this, I actually read. I remember after I read Cold Harbor, I devoured the rest of the series, and the most recent volume just came out in 2017, as a way of presenting a narrative which, you know, in military history, we sometimes dismiss battle narratives as drum and trumpet history. You know, it's a bit out of fashion, or it's, you know, there's a little bit of sneering about it. I think if you want to see how a narrative history can be analytical and precise and advance our knowledge, these books are fantastic for it. They're written with the pace and excitement that you'd find in a popular history, but the precision you'd find in an academic history. Also, the maps are terrific. His use of maps is very clever. And they're so readable. They're so readable. You can read them for fun, or you can read them as a serious academic study. And considering he does these in his spare time, because he's a lawyer, it puts all of us to shame, to be quite honest. It really does. And so when occasionally it crops up, for example, particularly with MA students who want to write a study of a battle or a division in action or something like that in the First World War, and they go, well, how can I make this analytical? Even though it's not to do with their war, I say, have a look at how Gordon Rear does it with his Overland Campaign series, because he will show, he's a model to follow about how you can write a narrative, make it so precise, new information on almost every page, and just brilliantly written at the same time. And anybody who's listening, you want a great series of books about this, highly recommended. I don't get any royalties from these, but they inspired me. They've inspired my work.
You sound like a YouTube influencer
there. but they've inspired my work. You know, I've tried to. I've only ever had a chance to do one of these. I published an article about British 28th Division in 1915 and their last battle on the Western Front, where they got smashed at Loos. And I really tried to consciously mimic Gordon Rear's style. Given the peer reviews, especially the initial peer reviews, I'm not entirely sure I succeeded in that. But he directly inspired my work, so I highly recommend. Even if you're not interested in the Civil War, it doesn't matter. If you want to see a great military narrative, these are the books to look at.
Okay. Oh, yeah, okay, that sounds good. Because it is always, there is an issue about how you manage to make that transition from wanting to write about a battle or an action or something like that, and to in some way make it analytical. So it sounds like it's a good way of getting to grips with that particular issue, because so many times, and we've all probably done this ourselves, you end up describing the battle rather than analysing it, because you get swept along by the narrative of this happened and that, and this is interesting, and how do you get into the meat of why things are happening? It's always an angle, particularly at postgrad, but also undergraduate level as well, is you're trying to get people to think about in terms of not how things happened, but why. Why did they happen in that way? And that's kind of the big difference in kind of history, where you're trying to delve into the heavier, the darker questions, or the more difficult, challenging questions. So it sounds like something to follow.
One point I'd say on that too is I think you can only get into those really challenging questions if you've done a lot of research. And this, in no way is this a knock on popular authors who write books that are going to draw people in, like we've already discussed, Battle of Midway. But they're writing to a fairly short deadline. They're writing for a particular market. They're not going to go into that depth necessarily. They don't have the time. They don't have the inclination, and so there is a tendency to just repeat the stories that everybody knows. Whereas Gordon Rear's books, they only come out occasionally. There's I think he started the series in the mid-90s. He hasn't quite finished the series, or did he finish? Anyway, the last book came out in 2017. So he's been working on this for 20 years in his spare time. 6 volumes, all meticulously researched. So he's got the luxury, he can take a bit of time. And I think I use that as an example with my postgraduate students, especially about you can write a narrative quite quickly based on limited research, but if you really want to analyze it, you're going to have to really, really go back to the basics and look at the primary sources. And
there's
and
something
really
to be said for
it's
asking basic questions, and I will add this real quick is that a lot of this goes down with simply walking the battlefield. So when I was an undergraduate, we were taken on a tour of like Gettysburg. And of course, at Wolverhampton, we've offered modules that involved tours of battlefields as well, like Naseby. And sometimes just kicking over the ground and saying, well, why were they in the peach orchard? I mean, basic questions that go beyond just a sort of, as you say, left flank, right flank, blue arrow versus red arrow, two-dimensional account of battles, but to actually kick the ground around, walk it around, think about it, and just say, well, what was it really like? And what can we gain almost archaeologically as well? Archaeological battlefield tours have really come into their own in the past 20, 30 years. And I think that's important because, again, it's a way of asking basic questions that help explain why things happen the way they did, that unfortunately a lot of mainstream books sometimes just take for granted. And we can't take things like that for granted.
Yeah, good point. Okay, moving things on for my second book, I suppose I'm in life number 2. This is a book which I read as an undergraduate. It's already been out a few years, but it was the first book which I read which I didn't have to as an undergraduate, and that's kind of an important point. Sometimes, here's we've got to read in order to answer this question, and blah, blah, blah. But it was mentioned in a course I was doing. It was a course, I think it was a course on Europe, strategy and politics, or something of war. It was called, and run by John Gooch, and he mentioned this book, which was Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of British Naval Mastery.
That was one of my runner-ups.
Fall of Great Powers. Yeah, and because he's known more, Paul Kennedy, because he was a Brit, and before going to the States, and he's been at Yale a long time now, I think. And he's kind of known globally for The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which is the one which came later, about 10 years after he did The Rise and Fall of British Naval Mastery. And this is the one that's been, Great Powers one was translated in about 25 different languages, and it sold endless copies all over the world, and turned him into a major international historian and figure. but it was the rise of all the British naval mastery, which I remember. I remember reading as an undergraduate. I picked it up and it'd been mentioned. Oh, I'll have a look at this off the shelf at university, and took it back to student accommodation in Morecambe. And it was a cold, miserable morning. I was sort of lying under a duvet on the bed, sort of reading this thing, eating a bag of chipsticks or something. And it was the first time I hit some, and it kind of really grabbed me as to where history could be, and the kind of the links between the bigger picture and individual kind of battles, things. And it's very much, it's not really military history in the sense of it's not really about battles particularly, although battles play a part in the story that he's telling. But it's very much about the link of the bigger picture into why war or military affairs develop in the way they do, in the link between economic power and, in this case, naval power. And the idea, the traditional idea until this book came out, was that the British were natural seafarers, and they had this great tradition, and that's why they became the dominant naval power and so on in the 19th century in particular. And Kennedy's saying, well, that's only part of it, really. It's because they had the biggest industrial muscle, and the two were inextricably linked. And then it's kind of moved it onto a different level of understanding the interaction between war, politics, economics, and so on, and that kind of the view that yes, you can have your naval power, but it's linked to economic and industrial might by the 19th century in a way that wasn't hitherto accepted. And it was quite. It's since, looking back on it now, you can see that it is almost like an imperial. It's a book about the British Empire as well as much about naval power. And it was interesting to find out that Kennedy had been supervised with his PhD by John Gallagher. And if you remember Gallagher and Robinson, who did their stuff on the free trade imperialism, that are pivotal. Apparently, the most quoted academic article in history ever is the I think it's called the free trade and imperialism, something like the imperialism of free trade. Yep. And it's Gallagher and Robinson had written this article in a book that came out in the early 60s, which basically said that why imperialism had grown in the 19th century the way that it had. I remember studying that as an undergraduate and then teaching it as well. We taught it for a long time as well. Of course, colleague John Benson, a colleague of ours, who's divided this course about imperial policy. Kennedy was actually supervised by Gallagher, as well as A.J.P. Taylor. So if you have two people as your doctoral supervisors, A.J.P. Taylor and John Gallagher, that's pretty impressive, really, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And I remember the Rise and Fall of Naval Mastery, and just thinking it's a product of its time. It's about imperialism, but it's also a product, in retrospect now, you can see it's a product of the 1970s. I remember Andrew Lambert, Howard's favourite historian, writing about it, saying that it's very declinist. There's kind of delved into this whole argument that Britain was in a period of decline, and Kennedy was writing in a period of decline, looking back very negatively about economic decline caused naval collapse and all sorts of things. It's intertwined with that kind of where history is written, the period in which it's written, as much about what it's written about. And so it's a good example of that as well. So yeah, I remember distinctly reading that book in, when would this be? About 1986. So it'd been out about a decade by then, because it came out in the mid-1970s. And then Kennedy brought out a series of other books in the late 80s onwards, which I devoured and read as well, including Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which is probably the most influential work in some ways. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. If you're going to read a good book which links military or naval power to the bigger picture in a way which situates how history develops, because you can trace historiographical trends since then, Rise and Fall of British Naval Mastery, definite winner.
Yeah, well,
so
if
it's
I
been
may,
out for it's been out for a while. So how do you find your students react to it now?
If you can get them to read it, it is kind of interesting to read anything in considerable depth. I set it as a debate because, as we know, history is much more about the debates about how history is interpreted, as about what it's interpreted, trends. So we set it up in one of the courses that we do, where we have that as a kind of the traditional classic interpretation of the decline of British naval or maritime power in the 20th century, and set it against kind of more kind of revisionist ideas, the kind of the Lambert School and so on, which says that actually it's not an inevitable decline. It was mismanagement and naval powers which were important and so forth. So you can set it up with a contrast. If you do it in small snippets and things, then it works quite effectively. One other thing that Kennedy did, which we do use quite a lot, is he did a lot of work on Alfred Mckinder and the Heartland theory. The argument about continental masses start to take over from maritime powers at the end of the 19th, early 20th century and start to dominate. It's a natural development that once you access in mass continental interiors of population and resources, they're going to overwhelm smaller maritime powers, which had previous 400 years dominated because of their access and use of the sea. And so you set it then up as a debate. So you can then get people to read Kennedy's stuff from that period and then contrast it with more modern interpretations like the Lambert School and so on, and get them to think about, is it inevitable? Is there a difference?
If I may,
I'm treading on Howard's territory here, but you may indeed, Howard.
The first thing that struck me, John, when you mentioned your second choice for your favorite book, is that you've got two naval history books. So I want to know why you're spending all this time on the British Army in the Second World War. You've fallen from the pure faith.
I started in air, sea,
John,
naval.
you've come back to the fold. The sea is calling you. All right. Well, I just want to say also, it's kind of a plug, that our second year level 5 undergraduate course, Pax Britannica, does have a set essay question. And the essay question, I've just opened it up, I'll read out. Paul Kennedy's modern classic, The Rise and Fall of British Naval Mastery, 1976. Suggested factors like nationalism and technology undermine Britain's sense of naval supremacy, in parentheses, and imperial defense. Discuss historians who have both agreed and disagreed with this argument since then. I have had students in past couple of years who have taken on this question. I see them as sort of mini Paul Kennedys, who probably, when he was a student doing his dissertation, supervised, as you said, by H.E.P. Taylor and Gallagher, was probably a naval buff. He was probably, had seen Battle of the River Plate. They're interested in battles and Midway and warships. And yet these are imperial defense, or say imperial historians, people who want to talk about the economic issues, the social trends, larger political, geostrategic concerns. And Kennedy's dissertation, of course, was able to inject naval history and perhaps a discussion of naval strategy and even tactics and technology and changes that were going on as part of this wider narrative. So they were able to feed off of each other, and the result was Paul Kennedy turned in a great piece of work. But as you say, it is contentious because, of course, the word fall is in there. So it's the rise of it is palatable enough. But when you talk about fall or decline or things like that, people are like, nah, I'm not so sure that that's necessarily the case because, of course, Britain, for whatever reason, came out on top in two subsequent world wars. How do you explain that? This kind of thing. So there's good and there's bad with it. But again, you can always come back to his argument because fundamentally his argument in many ways still makes perfect sense. And it is backed up by a tremendous amount of historical evidence in addition to the scholarship that Kennedy himself brings. It was actually one of my backup choices. I actually pulled the book off the shelf. This was on my reading list as an undergraduate. By then it had come out and we were made to read this. And it was tough. It was a tough read as an undergraduate. It's quite dense. And the students that tend to answer this question, it's hard to get the students to not just say, well, this is what he argues, period, but to say, this is what historians have argued since then, who both agree and yet disagree. And that's where you do get into a real debate. Lambert, of course, would say that a lot of questions about rise and fall is a question of choice. It's about political will. It's the will to power. It's the will to create. And had it not been for a change in willpower, as such, Britain might not have been in the same position in the 20th century. And even now, I think Lambert's arguing that the First World War would have been a totally different story had the Royal Navy rammed it into Germany at the beginning and left France to.
Oh yes. I remember the conference. I remember the conference or the seminar where he said that, which is quite interesting.
Well, I mean, his latest book on Corbett is coming out and saying the exact same thing, but it's just this idea that decline was an act. It wasn't a matter of inevitability. you'd be
Yeah,
mistaken for reading
exactly.
Kennedy that way. It's a matter of choice, and take that as you will.
It's an interesting debate, of course, and that's how we can set that up quite neatly. Okay, I'm conscious of the time that we've already rattled on now for about an hour. So do we want at this point to draw this particular cast to an end, or do our third books, or move it on to a different occasion?
Well, we've promised three
We could
books,
do
but I'm
our
going to do
final
my book
books
in
as a
1 minute.
Okay, all right. Okay, let's do it like this. You've got a 1 minute pitch to sell me a
pitch.
book. There you go.
All right.
Off you go, Howard. Go.
My third book is War in European History by Michael Howard. Michael Howard is considered to be the founder of modern war studies, and this was on my reading list way back when. It's well used. It's, whatever, brown pages, and we still put it on our reading list at War Studies at Wolverhampton, and for good reason. And what I like about it, I guess it's a tiny book. It's very slim. The students tend to look at books if they're going to say, oh, I'll definitely buy this one, or I'll pluck this one off the shelf. This is an easy one. But I like to give Michael Howard to students, and I was still very impressed with Michael Howard even to this day as a timeless example of how well huge topics can be synthesized down. It's very small, but it's very dense. And to say that it's dense does not mean that it's the same thing as dry. Michael Howard is not dry. Michael Howard is beautiful. It's a beautifully written piece of work. It's very eloquent. There's so much packed in every paragraph. There's so much wisdom pouring out of it, wisdom based on clear reading and research and thinking about it, that you're easily fooled by the size of it into thinking that this is going to be an easy one-off. It's not. It's very careful read, chapter by chapter. And the way he sweeps through a huge topic like that is a living example. Again, I try to tell our students, military history, war studies, of how good military history and war studies can be. It's not battle narrative. It's not a boring economic analysis. It's something else. It's almost pure undistilled war studies. And I chose that book because I still think it's a timeless classic of how good military history can be. 1 minute.
Yeah, I'm Tiger. I remember reading that one. It's top class, definite recommendation. Spencer.
Just to say, Michael Howard's that book was on my reserve list for my three. So there you go. Well, my last pick is a book that's definitely not thin. It's an absolute heavyweight, and it's Andrew Gordon's Rules of the Game, about Britain's Royal Navy in the late Victorian, Edwardian into the First World War period. I've picked it, one, because it's a book that I really enjoyed. I've always had a bit like you, John, despite being a historian of land warfare, I've always heard the call of the sea. And so something about naval battles in the First or Second World War have always really gripped me. And it's quite nice because you can sort of view them as a tourist if you view yourself as a land warfare specialist without being told off too much, because naval warfare is full of sharks and they terrify me. So I think Gordon's Rules of the Game is a fascinating book. It's a great book, not merely for the history that's in it, but also for the influence it's had, because that book, written in I think published in the mid-90s from memory, it still has an influence on the modern British military to this day, because it's not just a history of the Battle of Jutland, it's a history of the Royal Navy's officer corps. And of course, his argument distilled is that years of peace, decades of peace, almost a century of peace, had completely atrophied the Royal Navy's command and leadership style. And that when suddenly it found itself in conflict with a really active, aggressive enemy, the Imperial German Navy, the Royal Navy was not set up for this and failed effectively. Its leadership failed, and that still has a big influence on the modern British military to this day. It's still read. I've lost track of the number of military conferences I've been at where this Gordon's book crops up. So I think, as well as being a really interesting history in itself of a period of history, it shows how history can influence the present. It's a very real book in the modern British military, and with the current crisis in Ukraine, and of course the army and Navy, Air Force are all suddenly thinking, oh my goodness, potential major conventional war. It's not merely a theoretical possibility. It's causing the military to look itself again and go, okay, yes, there's been counterinsurgency wars, but hasn't been a major conventional war in a long time. What processes work, what don't. And Gordon is still cited as a cautionary tale. I think it's a fascinating bit of history. Um, really, it was controversial at the time. It shook things up and so on. Yes, it's been modified and people have argued this way or the other. But as an analytical study of an officer class in a period of peace and then transitioning to war, it's really interesting. Yes, it's dense. The first half is quite heavy going because it's all about the Navy in peacetime. And I know you're a peacetime Navy specialist, Howard. But to military readers, you might find lots of things about how Evan Thomas was in charge of the Royal Yacht and things a bit dry. But it does make a point. It's making a point about actually peacetime naval work is quite boring. And then suddenly you're being shot at by high explosive shells from German battleships, and oh my goodness, or your previous peacetime training actually proves to be, is it the best preparation? Has it really prepared you for this? That's the argument and the ideas that Gordon explores. So that's my top book.
Yeah, I've dipped into that one and used it when we've taught that period as well. So yeah, top class. I remember it coming out as well. So it's kind of the reviews and so on of it. It's interesting stuff. Okay, final pitch for mine, and a 1 minute pitch for my third book. My third book is a great example of a historian who changes where they see what work they've done, their career path, and it's going in one direction. Suddenly something triggered and they go in a completely different direction and have a real impact. And the historian is Terry Kopp, a Canadian historian, wrote a fantastic book, Fields of Fire, the Canadians in Normandy, 1944. Now, previously, he'd been a social historian. And one of our colleagues we mentioned before, John Benson, who was himself a social historian of the same kind of vintage almost, knew him from knew Terry Kopp's work from his previous life. So I mentioned that Terry Kopp was coming to do a paper at the university, Wolverhampton, or one of our war studies seminars many years ago. He said, "Why have you invited him? That's kind of my subject area." I said, "No, it's not. He's a military historian." And it was the same guy. And what he did, he brought a different way of looking at this subject, and very much the antithesis of the traditional military history writing style, which is very anecdotal. It's very layered stories and things that that you've picked up from this general said that and that person said this and so on. That's how you create your narratives and things. And Kopp had gone back and he'd gone very much into the primary sources, particularly operational research records. And he'd got data, real data. At least, it might not be complete. They might be flawed in lots of kind of ways. But rather than listening to what the veterans had been saying, what the traditional stories were of a particular campaign, he got myself, well, what were the people on the ground at the time saying? And so it was a really good example of how you go back to primary sources and reinterpret a campaign. I remember him doing a conference paper on this in the mid-90s. And I saw him delivering this paper, and it was all about how many hits to knock out a Sherman, what was the survivability of a crew based on operational research records, and so on. A lot of statistical analysis, and it's not watertight, but it was a whole new dimension to the way in which you interpreted how the campaign was fought. And he brought a whole different way of looking at it, and he's a pivotal, important figure in the development of Canadian military history, which has also then had an impact on the way we studied the British Army. So I have gone back to what kind of the main thing I've done the last 20 years, Howard. It's not just about watery history, about land warfare. It just made me think about the subject in a completely different way, and that was kind of the main inspiration of thinking about what's the British Army doing. He's writing about the Canadians. What are the British Army? How is that functioning? What are the records like for these guys during this period? And so that's kind of what the influences to go back and to look at all that kind of stuff. So if you want to look at the introduction to Fields of Fire is really important because he lays out much more about the interaction between history and military affairs or campaigns as being a part of political structure as opposed to being it's just about the battles and how things are fought, and that kind of a balance of, well, the Germans were really good at this and the British were rubbish at that, the Canadians were worse at this. It's much more about what's the end goal, what you're trying to achieve here, and do they have a plan at the start of the campaign, which has rather been ignored. And he really emphasised that the Anglo-Canadian armies fought to a particular plan and a method. So if you want to know about the Normandy campaign and the starting point, that would be something I would definitely recommend. Terry Cott. There you
Excellent.
There you
Fine,
go. All right.
fine volume. Fine volume.
go. Okay, right. So we've managed in the amount of time we've got to pitch 3 books, 3 recommendations each, for people potentially coming to study. Or just want to take their interest further, or things which have influenced us. I think it's been really useful. So I think we should draw a close to our ruminations at this point. So thank you for your insights, and we shall pick up the story of a different angle, a different aspects of military history, perhaps something relating directly to what we do at Wolverhampton in some way, in delivering on our interests and things, and getting it out to the students and getting them engaged in some kind of way next time in our next podcast. So thank you very much, gentlemen. I shall see you all very soon.
Thank you.